Hi there. This is Kick the Acorn, and this is chapter 23 to 25 review of APUS history. Although this may not be the chapters the way that you study your course or the College Board, this is the time period of 1938 to 1961. There's three different topics we'll talk about. First one is World War II. This would be 1939 to 1945, but we'll mainly focus on 1941 to 1945 because, as you hopefully know, the United States didn't join the war until then. So first, let's talk about appeasement. To prevent conflict, the U.S. remained neutral at first. So the United States was not interested in getting into a war at this point, and if you use context, why is because they were still in a Great Depression and they needed to get out of it, and they were already had their own problems. Last thing they needed was even more problems. And it was the same thing for European nations. They didn't want conflict either, so they appeased to Hitler's violations of the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany was not allowed to have a military that was a certain size, and there was a lot of restrictions, but Hitler broke these by creating a large army, and he broke a lot of the rules that were in the Treaty of Versailles that was made at the end of World War I. And they did not, they thought that if they tried to take action, then it could spark a war, so they were just like, fine. And they just left it alone. That's what appeasement is. And then there was the Munich conference, and I know that there's a lot of conferences you got to know for this time, but this one was when Germany was allowed to annex the Sudetenland as long as he doesn't invade other countries. So they were like, this was a form of appeasement. They were like, okay, fine, you can get this, but just don't do anything else. And then as you see, too bad, Hitler invaded anyways, both Czechoslovakia and Poland. And by the time he invaded Poland, the war started. So as stated, as I just said, after Germany invaded Poland, the war began. The U.S. did not join, but was considered a threat by other countries in the war because the U.S. was neutral, and at the same time, the United States wasn't, because there was still economic ties with nations such as France or Great Britain. And Germany and Japan were aware of this, which is what likely led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor that we'll talk about in a minute. And although there were neutrality acts made, no supporting, trading, or traveling, and there was cash and carry. But the reasons for neutrality were the Great Depression, history of what happened, World War I, and the Versailles Treaty. So they didn't want to bring back what troubles had already happened. Without the United States, the results, I'm not necessarily saying this is why these results happened because the United States wasn't in there. This is just what happened before the United States was in there. The Axis powers were in the lead in the first part of the war, and they are JIG, that's how I remember them, the main ones. Japan, Italy, Germany, they were the main ones. And the truth was, throughout the course of the war, Japan and Germany were pretty successful in some of their battles until there was turning points. Italy, however, there was a lot of opposition within the country itself, so it wasn't able to be very successful in its goals, trying to be like Germany. France fell to Germany, and there was Vichy, however you say it, France. And the Nordic states were conquered. meaning Norway and Denmark, the USSR was pushed back, and Great Britain was in ruin from bombardment. We'll talk about the USSR issue because it was originally on the side of the Axis powers. United States joins. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the United States declared war the next day on the 8th. This was considered to be a fault of Japan because the United States clearly was militarily advanced. That's not correct typing. Sorry about that. And it's considered awaking a sleeping giant because the United States may have not been in the war, but Japan should have been aware of the military abilities that the United States had. And so let's see what happened. Let's first talk about the Pacific Theater. So theater means just the part of the war. We consider there to be a European and Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater mostly concerns Japan and the United States, and it's in the Pacific. And then the European Theater considers obviously Europe, but also in Africa, mostly North Africa. And the United States also was involved in that too. So, but the Pacific Theater, at first the Japanese were successful. The United States wasn't prepared for this. So Japan won some of the initial battles, but the Battle of Midway was a turning point. And a turning point means that whatever was being attacked is now doing the attacking. Or they're basically in the lead, they're being more successful. So the United States was being attacked, but it started to be the one attacking and pushing the Japanese back instead of the Japanese pushing the Americans back. So island hopping was a strategy used to attack smaller islands. They knew that if they attacked bigger islands, then it could cause problems because there was really devastating battles. So if they just attacked the smaller ones, they would still be in the lead. And the Japanese began to understand American codes. So Navajo language was learned, which is a Native American language, so the Japanese didn't understand them. And the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, obviously there was a lot more in the war, but the main things that you need to know are these things. There was other battles also, like Iwo Jima. But the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, these were very destructive bombings, and they forced Japan to surrender with thousands and thousands of civilians killed with the bombs, which was unfortunate, but it did allow for the war to end in 1945, and at least the Pacific Theater part, because Japan did surrender after this. Now, the European theater. As stated, Germany was successful in taking over Europe at first, prior to the United States entry. And he conquered Poland, France, Norway, Denmark, and more. But when the United States joined, it helped fight against Italy and Germany in North Africa. And so they were starting to, the United States hadn't been yet attacked by these Axis powers. So it was still able to fight. Whereas, Great Britain could also fight. It wasn't completely destroyed, but France and all the other nations, they were mostly helpless. The USSR also, though, like Great Britain and the United States, could help too. And as we'll learn about the conferences, those were the three main countries that were at the conferences because they were the main ones that could do things. Stalingrad was a battle, something to take note of. There was a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin before the war, which means they wouldn't attack each other. And they got to both have what they wanted from Poland. But after Germany invaded Poland and then attacked the USSR, that broke the non-aggression pact. And so more and more USSR land was being taken by the Germans. But at Stalingrad, the USSR was successful in pushing Germany back, and this is considered a turning point. It was a very good victory for the USSR. D-Day, at D-Day, France was invaded, and by the Allies, you might say, hey, well, remember, they were being controlled by Germany, so they had to. They invaded Normandy, and they were able to get control back. The Battle of the Bulge, this was the last major attack on Germany that caused Germany to surrender, and shortly after, there was the death of Hitler. And VE Day is considered when Germany surrendered. Okay, now let's talk about the conferences in the war and after the war. There was the Atlantic Conference, and there were more than these, but these are the main ones. And the Munich one is considered before, so these are the during and after ones. The Atlantic Conference, there was agreements made between Roosevelt and Churchill, not Stalin. And I'd say not Stalin, you need to take note of this because we'll talk about this more later on, but that is important regarding the Cold War. And so they made some agreements and about what they were going to do regarding the European theater, major decisions that Stalin was left out on. In the Casablanca, there was a decision to fight until surrender by the Allies, but not Stalin. So also, once again, Roosevelt and Churchill. And then the Tehran Conference, this was a decision to fight a new front in Europe and demilitarize Germany. And Stalin was there this time. Yalta, this is where they decided how to divide Germany, and this would later prove to not be a very good idea. And there was some disagreements at this conference. And then the Potsdam, there was post-war decisions, and Stalin said that there will be no elections in Eastern Europe. And that is a major thing because that conflicts the ideas of Truman and earlier Roosevelt. Now let's talk about things that happened in the US during World War II. Luckily, there wasn't actual fighting there for the most part. Women, there was Rosie the Riveter, which was a figure that convinced women to work in wartime factories. And then for African Americans, Truman ordered desegregation in the military. This is significant. This is one of the first signs of desegregation. And then Japanese Americans in a Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus United States, Japanese Americans were prohibited by the to be in the West Coast area for fear of another attack like Pearl Harbor. So basically, they were just sort of discriminated for purposes, safety purposes, as they said. So that was World War II. That took long enough, but we have two more things to do. Chapter 24, Cold War begins. This is leading to 1953. And 1953 is when Stalin died and we had a new leader there. Mistrust, USSR mistrust. So let's talk about reasons why the USSR might not trust the United States. And of course, it is a good idea to bring in things that you didn't just learn in this unit, but all units. And if you're watching this as a review for the whole course, you would definitely know that. But Palmer raids, obviously, this is not something we talked about in this video, but the Palmer raids back in the 20s, remember Mitch Palmer? He was trying to prevent any spread of communism, and he was fighting against the Bolsheviks. And then there was the Battle of the Bulges. Within the battle, the United States was proved to be a very successful military. And this one, maybe not so much as the other ones, but they could see how powerful the United States was, and it could be a threat. In the Versailles Treaty, there was some disagreements and some things that the Russians did not like. And then the Potsdam Conference and Yalta Conference, same things. And then Atlantic Conference, they were left out. And the Bolshevik, for a long time, the USSR was not recognized until 1932, I believe it was. And that was another source of mistrust. The atomic bomb use on Japan also was considered a threat, that they think that could be them. And that makes it seem like they're more powerful. But that's just to name a few. There's lots of other things also. Other way around, though, why would the United States mistrust USSR? The Bolshevik Revolution, what fundamentals they had goes against the typical American ideas of democracy and freedom. And same thing, they disagreed with some things for Potsdam and Yalta. They did not like that Stalin said there would be no free elections. Free elections, that's what they always have in the United States. The Battle of Stalingrad, they could see how powerful the USSR army was, similar to the Battle of the Bulges. And they could see the invasions throughout World War II of the Soviets. Okay, a proxy war. So a proxy war is a war that is, well, first let's start out by saying the Cold War is called that because there is considered to be no actual fighting. However, there's proxy wars where there was fighting, and it did have to do with Americans and Soviets. After Japan fell, Korea was split into two at the 38th parallel. There was North Korea and South Korea. North was under Soviet control, and the South was under American control. War began after North Korea invaded South Korea, and the UN stepped in, United Nations. There was no defeat or victory. There was just a truce in 1953. And this just displays how nations that are under the influence of these two competing ideas can fight in situations like this. And we'll later see within different proxy war what else happens. McCarthyism. There was a man named McCarthy, and he claimed he had a list of US officials that were actually communists. And so McCarthyism just refers to the sort of fear of communists everywhere in America. The HUAC, I'm pretty sure it's the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and it investigated un-American activities. So it was like, that doesn't seem American, so it doesn't necessarily mean communism, because it was, at first it investigated possible fascism when Germany was rising. There was a Rosenberg trial where there was a Russian couple. They were electric chaired, so that means they were killed, and that doesn't that's a big thing. And it was for supposedly stealing American plans. And then the Hollywood 10, these were actors that were suspected of communism, and they stood their ground in trying to be able to get back to their jobs, but it just displays the McCarthyism fear, and that was investigated by the HUAC. Fair deal. This was a deal that Truman created, President Harry Truman, and he called for better housing, full employment, higher minimum wage, better farm price supports, new TVAs, and extension of Social Security. These were all things that he wanted to improve, and this was a strategic thing that he did because it appealed to almost everyone, because there was a lot of division, and it appealed to just normal Democrats, Southern Democrats, and even some Republicans. Okay, now let's talk about the mid-Cold War and the 1950s. 1950s being a separate thing. As you can see, Rosa Parks in the picture. That's separate from the Cold War. Acts in this time. So let's just talk about what acts were made in this time, which is 1953, 1961. There was the Eisenhower Doctrine, which said that it would support any Middle Eastern country that may be under the communist influence. And then the Warsaw Pact was basically like NATO, but it was just a communist version. And then Lebanon, that nation, was given aid. That's not really an act. But then there was the Federal Highway Act of 1956 that Eisenhower made. That's why we have interstates. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This called for inspection of any unequal possible situations. And that was a big step in civil rights. Notable people in this time. I'm not going to read this all, but these are important people. I will state the most notable, Ho Chi Minh, if that's how you say his name. He was in Vietnam, and we'll talk about that more, how he led a communist resistance. Nikita Khrushchev, if that's how you say that also, was the new leader in the USSR after the death of Stalin. And then Eisenhower was the president then, and then Rosa Parks, and then Martin Luther King Jr., Earl Warren, and Thurgood Marshall. These were notable people in the civil rights that we'll talk about also. But we're mostly going to be looking at questions and how we can use knowledge from this unit. I'm not going to really explain specific things but just how you can use what you know. So we're supposed to figure out what facts could support this statement. Economic growth in the 1950s served as a source of conformity in the US domestically. So what allowed people to be conform or like similar in their ways? And that was TVs, the Federal Highway Act, and credit card invention, because all three of these things allowed people their culture to be similar in the way that they were going places, more mobility. They were watching the same things, able to buy the same things. But what about this one? Okay. Social expectations and values in the 1950s provided a sense of conformity. You could once again use TVs. That second statement, not exactly sure how to pronounce that, televangelists. These were what's the right word for it? Basically just Christian services like Holiday that were on TV, and the invention of a transistor which allowed for more computers. The US Supreme Court in the 1950s and early 60s stood as a means to protect citizens who were marginalized. What could support that statement? The Sweat versus Painter, Brown versus Board of Education, and Boynton versus Virginia cases, because they all helped African Americans have more equality, because in the first one, they investigated a student who was denied access into a school. The second one that called for desegregation, and the third one called for desegregation. The second one was in schools, and the third one was in roadside facilities. Different sources of dissent struggled against what was viewed as American societal weaknesses. What shows this? The beatniks, rock and roll, and freedom riders, because all of these things displayed new differences that arose in this time period. During the 1950s, there was a continuation and expansion of Cold War policies. What shows this? Eisenhower Doctrine, because that's similar to the Truman Doctrine. It just tries to support any nation that might be under communist influence. Brinkmanship, that displays the US's continuation of rivalry with the USSR. And then the Mossadegh, I don't really know how to say that, government that was in Iran. This also is similar to the Eisenhower Doctrine. They were trying to get oil interests, but also prevent communism to spread to that region. And identify and describe two ways in which 50s were like the 20s, 1950s and 20s. Here's what response I have. The 1950s were like the 1920s because they contained economic prosperity as well as the introduction to new culture. In the 1920s, the incomes of many increased due to policies allowing for loans and installment plans. Similarly, in the 1950s, there were also prosperity due to policies due to similar reasons. That's pretty redundant. Sorry about that. In addition, cultural changes also occurred. Furthermore, in the 1920s, jazz was introduced as a new cultural realm, and in the 1950s, rock and roll was first introduced, which allowed for traditional ways of life to be altered. These similarities display the correlation of post-World War I and post-World War II America. Next, explain how the baby boom would have contributed to economic prosperity in the 1950s, of the 1950s. The baby boom contributed to economic prosperity in the 1950s because the increased population allowed for more labor in the white-collar jobs. These were jobs that were not manual labor, which these resulted in the invention of the transistor, or resulting from the invention of the transistor, sorry. This labor force would allow for a successful industry, which allowed for more affordable products for many, resulting in economic prosperity. Identify and explain how one event or fact from the era of American imperialism, the late 19th through 1914, 19th century through 1914, would have contributed to a Cold War event. The U.S. annexation of the Philippines in the times of imperialism led to economic ties and understanding for the need for democratization in foreign states. Consequently, the U.S. naturally would support France in keeping the colony of Indochina instead of supporting the Vietnamese of Ho Chi Minh. I already talked about that. That was bound to form a nation and to threaten democracy. Last one, during the 1950s, through an era that is sometimes associated with conservatism and conformity, citizen activism seemed to be emerging. Identify one example of the emerging citizen activism in the 1950s through the early 60s. Activism in the 1950s and 60s includes the emerging call for integration in US schools. In the case of Sweat versus Painter, a student was denied access into a white school and forced into a black school, challenged the quality and soundness of the segregation laws, Jim Crow laws specifically. It's important to be specific in your responses. I probably should have stated that. And activism's success continued with the Brown versus Board of Education, prohibiting segregation in school, and would reach an all-time high in the later 1960s. In my opinion, more could be said there. I apologize for that response, but you need to try to say as much as you can and be as specific as you can. At least I said Sweat versus Painter and Brown versus Board of Education. But the key is being specific and making sure what you say actually adds up and connecting things. These are short answer responses though, so obviously different things apply for a DBQ, LQ. Good luck on your test. Hopefully this was helpful to you in understanding and reviewing this unit. Thank you for watching.